All right. Well, Melanie, thanks so much for joining me. Why don't we get started by just hearing a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Yeah, for sure. So currently I work as the Director of People Ops at Accelerated Digital Media, which is a performance marketing agency based and founded in Chicago, but we are a fully remote team. Prior to that, for about 12 years, I've worked in recruiting. So I worked for two pretty sizable recruiting firms. And most recently, before joining ADM, I was with Aquent, which is very focused on creative and marketing, which is really what drew me to the opportunity with ADM. And so at Vitamin T Aquent, they rebranded themselves after I left. I supported recruiting for primarily Chicago-based companies. And then I also led a team of 3 recruiters within the Chicago organization. So that's a little bit about my background.
Awesome. Yeah. I'm curious about what was the transition like from agency to, doing internal recruiting?
Yeah, it was a bit of a bigger jump than I expected. I think the first couple of candidates I interviewed that were not the right fit, I was like, wait, I have to find them something, because that was just what my thought process was when I used to interview people, was to be like, okay, they're not a good fit for this, but hey, I bet they'd be a good fit for this company. So that was a little bit of a struggle for probably, 3 weeks, until I was like, I can't manage these people's recruiting backgrounds very much. So that was probably the biggest challenge. Also, with working at a recruiting agency, you're working on freelance, you're working on contract hire, you're working on direct hire, and obviously at ADM, it was all direct hire. So the candidate timeline was a lot longer. So there were, opportunities at Aquent where I could fill a role in 3 hours. Obviously, that's not the case when it's direct hire, when you've got a lot of hiring team members to go through. So, but really, the idea of working at an agency, coming from a staffing agency, was the smoothest transition for me, because I really enjoyed that fast-paced environment. So I'm just seeing it now from a different side of things.
Yeah, and I imagine it's pretty cool too, because in your role as, the head of people, you also have a big impact on what happens after they get hired and the entire employee experience and employee life cycle. So I imagine that was a draw for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think a lot of times candidates ask me, like, what's your favorite part of the job? And I always talk about the team and the people and the opportunity. Since I've been with the company for almost 3 years, I've hired a huge chunk of our existing team. And so to be able to see their careers flourish, grow, get promoted, bring ideas to ADM, really adjust the way that we do things, is certainly the highlight. So a little bit different than placing somebody and then they go off and do great things at their company, and you don't really get that day in, day out understanding when they're working with you directly, and being able to see their career flourish, certainly way more rewarding.
Got it. Very cool. And so tell me a little bit about ADM, just to set the stage for everybody that's listening. How many employees? What's the company like?
Yeah, for sure. So we are a performance marketing agency. We've been around about 7.5 years. Our team size is just around 30. When I joined 3 years ago, we had 15 people. And to highlight, at the start of COVID, they had 4. So definitely we've seen a ton of growth within the last several years. We do paid marketing, paid media for search, which is Google and Microsoft Bing, social, so Meta and all of the other different social channels, and programmatic, which is a lot of streaming audio and connected TV. And we work with direct-to-consumer e-commerce and digital health clients to help support their paid media programs. And so the majority of our team is executing within those clients. So they're very client facing and doing the work for the clients. And then we've got just a handful of team members that are more internal. So myself, obviously, we've got a marketing manager that handles everything for our website and blog posts and things of that nature. And then our associate director of business operations that does a ton on the sales front.
Very cool. And I know we talked a little bit about the catalyst and what excited you about joining ADM, but what was the catalyst for them to go out and find somebody to be ahead of people at the company?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something I think is really interesting is most agencies of our size at the time certainly do not. They don't go in and bring on a head of people. They don't look to even have an internal recruiter. So prior to me joining, they worked with a ton of different staffing agencies because they were doing a lot of hiring. But the reality is they didn't have somebody who understood the hiring timeline, the hiring process, what it looks like from the point you meet them to the point that they start. And so through our CEO consulted with some people that were in the space that have a little bit more experience, and they recommended bringing on somebody to lead this team. So very much when I started, it was all about recruiting. They had about 6 or 7 openings when I first started, and that was the focus. And once we got those filled, then it was really looking to how to build the infrastructure of people operations. So it's really HR, but we've branded it because it's a little bit beyond just the traditional HR, but how do we develop our team? So it's focused on employee engagement. It's focused on managing their payroll and benefits, to a degree managing IT, making sure they have the equipment that makes sense and getting them what they need, and then helping from a performance management standpoint too. So we put together 30, 60, 90-day plans. We put together PIP templates for those circumstances where we do have to manage performance, and really facilitated our performance review plan overarchingly. So it is beyond just recruiting, but at the end of the day, recruiting is my bread and butter. That is the most important thing to continue to bring on new talent to join our team.
Yeah. And I think, what really stands out to me is like, at the end of the day, you guys are a people power business. Like, you're an agency, your services are driven by the people that are executing for your clients. And so it makes a lot of sense that even at, let's say, 15 employees, that you would start to invest in those people programs, both on the recruiting side to make sure that you're getting the best talent, but then also on just the broader employee lifecycle side to make sure that you're retaining and you're developing that talent. And ultimately, I imagine you can actually start to tie that to some business outcomes for the agency because it's so people dependent.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's great for the team to have somebody who's not in their day in, day out workflow, right? So yep. In most cases, you're going to, of course, go to your manager when you have questions and you're going to talk through that, but sometimes you need another person who has a different perspective. And I think that's what I bring to the table a lot of times. Like, I am part of all of the executive conversations, and I just see it from a different perspective than the client-facing team. And I think that really does help to give us a well-rounded view. Our CEO definitely always asks for my opinion, which honestly is really refreshing. I've worked for much larger organizations in the past, and that isn't something that you see on a regular basis. And it's great for me to be able to see it from a different perspective when I'm thinking about our people, when I'm thinking about me as a potential customer, when they're looking at client-related things. So I think it's certainly helpful to kind of give them a well-rounded understanding outside of, again, just the day in, day out with clients.
Yeah. And I think also the benefit of you joining early when the team is still of the size it is allows you to really embed yourself within the business and learn both the people and what they do on a day-to-day basis yeah. and their roles so much more, which then will help you significantly as you guys continue to grow, because you're just, so in tune with everything that's going on within the business. Where if you were to join a much bigger company, it's like, okay, there's too many people to really dive into like what everybody does around here to really, intimately understand their different roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, I will say one thing I love is when I'm interviewing candidates and then they like stop and they're like, wait, aren't you a recruiter? Because I do know what they're doing. Because, a lot of, and that's like that's what people think, like, oh, recruiters, you're just like filling a job description, which yes, but I know what they do. I'm part of those conversations. So while I can't jump into Google and build out an ad for them, I do understand it because I'm listening to it and I'm talking to it all the time. And then on the same token, one highlight is, I know my team's kids' names. Because of our size, I really do have a vested interest in the team and their success.
Yep. Makes a lot of sense. So, speaking of getting to know the team and learning about the business, when you just got started, you mentioned that, the number one priority was like, okay, we have a bunch of roles to fill. But if you think back to like strategically, what did you need to do on the recruiting side? When you came in, what were your priorities? What did you see and how did you go about tackling those?
Yeah, so the first thing was, again, coming from an agency, I know what that looks like on the other end. And so they pretty much took every single agency call. Any agency that saw a job description reached out and they're like, yeah, sure, send us candidates. And so that was definitely the first thing, was kind of muddling through all of those different options that they had and determining what made sense for us to move forward, and then really putting together processes. So at the time, and still to this day, the team uses Monday.com as our project management tool, which I'm a huge fan of, but that was our ATS. So we were literally manually inputting all of the data. And by we, I mean me. So I was manually putting in the team members, the candidates' names. I was putting in their resume, putting in all of the documentation, and then building up the process of a flow. So really, who needs to meet somebody, so that every single candidate was getting a very similar process. So I would vet them, then who are they going to meet, then who are they going to meet, and what do we need to do? So it was a ton of really building a process of how do we get from applicant to hire, and obviously in the most efficient and effective way possible. It took a minute. I think it took about 3 months for us to make our first actual hire, because just learning the processes and who do they need to meet. And we've obviously been able to shrink that time to hire down a little bit since then.
Nice. So it sounds like it was all about like starting with a DIY hiring process, using the tools and solutions that you already had available to you to help with the workflow of that process. And then was there a moment in time, or like a specific size you got or capacity, where you started to realize, okay, like this is a good foundation, but now we need to think about, an ATS or other types of solutions that could fit into the hiring process and make you guys more efficient?
Yeah, so I think towards the end of last year, so 2023, we started to resource plan for 2024. And based on the existing business that we were invested in, as well as what we were expecting from, pitches and new business. And in 2023, every single month we brought on a new account. So we were constantly in that growth mode. And so as we were entering into planning for 2024, there was going to be a lot more growth with that. And that really is what streamlined. We need a better process. We need to make it much more digestible for me, taking a little bit of the efficiency. And so it wasn't as manual by doing everything within Monday. And so that's really what the catalyst was. Again, from my work history prior to ADM, I knew a ton of different ATSs, because a lot of the clients we were working with had an ATS. And so I had to manage what that looked like. And honestly, some were great and some were really labor intensive, very difficult to manage. So I had an idea of what worked and what was going to work for a company our size.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like, I know you mentioned that obviously a big pain point for you is all the manual work involved in adding candidates to the project management system and tracking everything through. But what were some of the other challenges that you found yourself running into? And then like, how did you relate that to how it would essentially have an adverse impact on the hiring process? Like maybe because of this manual work, we were not hiring as fast as we need to, or whatever it may be.
Yeah. So two things that I would highlight is the hiring team was great. They were going to the interviews, but then they weren't doing anything with that information. So they weren't providing me any sort of immediate feedback. And so it was a little bit of a chase. And so obviously that wasn't always their priority. They needed to flip and get back to work. So I understood that, but so didn't always have a good, consistent experience for each candidate because of that. And then the second thing is we're a data-driven organization, and there really wasn't a ton of automated data that I was able to capture. As wonderful as LinkedIn is, it's not very pure data. And then everything I was putting into Monday, again, from a reporting perspective, was manual. I had to look at how many people came in through LinkedIn, how many people came in through our website, how many people were submitted if we were using an outside resource, things of that nature. And that data, while manual, was also not pure. It was definitely a lot of human error, because I was taking the data like when did the person apply, doing so much of the manual. And that was really important from an efficiency standpoint to have an analytics proponent of it. And that probably was what captured our CEO's attention on finally moving to an ATS, is the opportunity that I was going to be able to have reporting and be able to share very detailed responses of, this is when the role opened, this is when the person started. And that's, certainly really important. And also how much time our hiring team is spending in interviews, making sure that they're not interviewing 100 people for one role, and really that efficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And those are commonly, probably two of the most common problems that we hear when organizations are starting to get into the market and look for an applicant tracking system. If we back up to the hiring team feedback, how does that problem play out though in the hiring process? Like, I know that one of the biggest challenges for talent acquisition teams is, they're always complaining about chasing hiring managers down to get their interview feedback, to get their notes, and to get them to do it in a timely manner. How did that challenge, how is that playing out for you guys in the hiring process?
It was a lot of chasing, right? So it was sending a Slack message or following up with, the interviewer's boss to be able to say, hey, did you get the feedback from so-and-so? Could you get that for me? Could you put it into Monday so that we have it? And that would slow it down. It could be that there were some interviews on a Friday, right? And then on Monday we were, full steam ahead looking at other things. And so that candidate experience also wasn't great because they weren't getting follow up, because I didn't know how the interview process, how it went, or what they thought, or why they thought what they did. And also, they weren't necessarily as organized because it wasn't very solidified. Like, could you rank them from, this topic to this topic to this topic? It was honestly a lot of personal opinion, right? Like, yep, they were good, but they didn't do this or they didn't do this. And so that was a way that we needed to streamline so that every candidate was getting the same process, which is part of the reason, just to back up for a second, before we went to the ATS, that when we brought on the Spark Hire video interview as the first interview, that helped to streamline because the hiring managers got to see those videos and every single candidate was answering the exact same questions. So that was kind of the catalyst of getting the organization down, yep, so that it was seamless.
Yeah. So it was obviously about, empowering them to easily provide their feedback and do it in a timely manner, but also giving them some structure to do that so that you're evaluating candidates fairly. And ultimately, you're ending up with the best person for the role. And it sounds like, too, just the act of you having to go and chase hiring managers down for their feedback, that's not the best investment of your time either, right? Like, you could be spending it in many other areas at a lot more value, but to keep the hiring process moving along, and this is what a lot of folks in talent acquisition find themselves in this position, is like, I have to be the shepherd of the hiring process and really nudge people and make sure that I'm, collecting everything. But ultimately, like, if you can, with tools and with process, if you can, empower hiring managers to do it, and for those tools and processes to hold them accountable, it frees you up to do a lot of other things. So cool. That's really good feedback. It's interesting. And then on the data-driven side, it sounds like your CEO, data, I mean, obviously as a performance marketing agency, data is probably everything for you guys. It's the language that you speak all day long with your clients. So it's only natural that that is now something internally that was really important when you wanted to measure the efficacy of your recruiting efforts. And so it sounded like that was a really good thing to get that in front of him. And then also, for you guys, I imagine, without the data or without it being clean data or structured data, it was really hard to know what's working or what's not working. Like, everything from the channels, like when we post an ad on LinkedIn, like, are we getting enough quality candidates? Are we getting quality candidates at all? Or if we post over here, like figuring out where to spend, just as you would with, advertising budget with your clients. And then also, like you mentioned, like determining within the hiring process, are there stages where people are getting stuck? How long is this taking? Where are bottlenecks? And without that data and without that reporting, there's really no way that you can go, you don't know where to start to go about fixing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing, to go back to the feedback part for a sec, the team members, like, I put in the feedback immediately after I meet somebody, because I meet a lot of people, right? So if I interviewed you and then went into another interview 5 minutes later, my brain is going to be like, did Josh say that or did Adam say that? And so that's really important that they are giving like feedback on the spot versus, hey, you interviewed Josh a week and a half ago and I never heard back. What were your thoughts? Yeah, I didn't like him. Well, I need more data to understand what did you not like about him and things of that nature. So definitely, that speed of the process was really important. And that would also help with the analytics because the quicker you can make the process, the more pure the information will be.
Yeah, and that's a really good point about the timeliness of feedback as well. Is when it's timely, you're going to get more depth and context in that feedback versus like it's a no-go.
Right,
Which
exactly.
That's fine to get that answer to help make a decision, but it's not going to help you A, give that candidate feedback, and B, calibrate on, okay, why were they a no-go? How do we make sure that a candidate with that no-go profile doesn't get to that stage again, right?
Exactly. Yeah, the feedback is really very much two-sided. Like I now know when my VP of client growth, I'm like, he's going to love this person. I know enough of what that is because of the amount of feedback I've gathered versus, if you just say no, why? So I want to be able to provide some constructive feedback to the candidate if they ask. Some really want it, some have no interest in hearing constructive feedback, but also me. So I liked this person. I think they're a good fit. What was missing? And that really helps then the next time I'm meeting somebody, okay, so they were missing this really important skill set. I need to make sure that I ask about it in the next interview to make sure that we are getting much more qualified candidates in front of the hiring team.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. So you identify the need for an ATS based on the problems that you're facing. Where do you start, right? The market is vast. There's so many providers out there. How do you start that search process?
Yeah, so again, kind of knowing which ones I had no interest in from my previous work experience, and then really what makes the most sense for what we need. So again, I needed to make sure that I loved it because I'm going to be in it all day long, but also that the hiring team isn't going to find it to be an inconvenience to have to go to another page to do something. And so I needed it to be something that all they have to do is go to one website. All they do, they see everything. And so that was really important as we were identifying ATSs. Is it going to be all they have to do is click on the link in their calendar invite so that they don't have to do any heavy lifting and they automatically get everything that they need? That was key. Is it going to be super easy for them to navigate? Is it going to be very highly automated so that they're able to know exactly what they need to ask? So even if they walked in with zero preparation, they have everything they need. They have the resume, they have information about the candidate, they have notes from me or other hiring team members that have interviewed them, and they have the specific questions that they're going to ask and nice little boxes that they can fill out. So really that they should be able to provide immediate feedback as soon as they can. So those were the things that were the most important to me. And then of course, financial. So we didn't build an ATS into our budget as we were planning. And so that was something that was really important, was that is it going to be a financially smart decision? I've dealt with a lot of different vendors across a lot of different categories before, and there really could be such a wide range of what their costs are. And that was something that if we're investing in this, I need to know that it's going to be cost effective and we're going to be able to, it'll make a difference and the hiring team is going to be bought into it. Because the absolute worst thing is if I invest in it, I love it, and the hiring team still doesn't use it. So that was the thing that was the most important, was that ease of use without breaking our bank.
Interesting. It's really interesting to me how much you're taking into account the hiring manager experience when thinking about systems. What is the balance there, right? Like as you're evaluating an ATS, what's the balance of making sure the ATS is a good fit for you versus making sure that it's going to be a good fit for all the hiring managers that are going to need to work into it?
Yeah, because I'm a one-man band on the recruiting end, it probably is more important that they are able to use it. So really, like, knowing how they use Monday.com as our project management tool for their own daily deliverables, I wanted it to be as seamless to that as it could be. So truthfully, for me, it was more important that it worked well for them, because if it works well for them, then I'm getting the data and thus it's going to be more efficient for me. So it was definitely not a selfish decision. It was more, well, I guess it could be considered a selfish decision, because at the end of the day, it benefits me more, but it really was like getting how easy is this going to be for them versus, hey, you have to learn this whole new system and you need, an authorization code to log in. And of course it's 5 seconds before an interview, like all of those things that I know exist in other ATSs. I didn't want them to have to do. So definitely for me personally, it was more important that the team had an easy system.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, look, at the end of the day, especially on any lean talent acquisition team, I mean, really any talent acquisition team, hiring manager experience, candidate experience is ultimately what's going to drive results for the talent acquisition team, right? If you're delivering a really seamless hiring manager experience where it's easy for them to make decisions, easy for them to provide structured feedback, ultimately it's going to help them get a hire faster, and it's going to give you the feedback that you need to continuously produce better hires in the future for those similar roles. And then on the candidate experience side, it's a very similar thing. Like if you're not setting your candidates up for success, you don't have the necessary touch points in place, you're not going to get the results that you need as a talent acquisition professional. So if you can really empower candidates and hiring managers to have a really solid experience, and I feel like that's ultimately got to be the priority for a talent acquisition team, because you've got the chops to kind of pick up all the other pieces in between. But, naturally that's like, I would say one of the biggest challenges in the role is you have to navigate the hiring manager and candidate experience.
To your point, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but to your point about the candidate experience, there are several other ATSs out there that candidates hate, right? So you see it on LinkedIn, they post about it. Every time they log in, they need to create a whole new profile. I remember years ago, my husband was working with a recruiter and they submitted him to a job and they created an email for him. Like it was I was like, what are you talking about? They created an email for like a random email. And so there is that like such a high lift that like if somebody sees that specific ATS as a candidate, they're like, I don't even want to bother. Like it's going to be such a pain. The other thing I hear a ton is they upload their resume and then they have to answer every single question related to what's on their resume. And so that from a candidate perspective, what we ended up choosing has a great candidate experience, because they upload their resume, they answer a couple of questions that are a little bit deeper than their resume, and all of a sudden they're in front of us. So that is one huge call out, that the candidate experience does have to be considered when building an ATS.
Yep. And if we back up a little bit and think about internally, I know we talked about the importance of data to the CEO, the importance of the experience of gathering feedback from hiring managers and making sure it's easy for them to use, and making sure that it's not a burden from the other systems and tools that they're using on a day-to-day basis. How do you incorporate all of those different stakeholders into the process of selecting an ATS, and were they involved in that process?
Yes, great question. So truthfully, it was more my choice and kind of bouncing it off of the CEO and then pulling in our VP just to get his buy-in as well. Honestly, the hiring managers didn't have a say. I wasn't going to, I don't want to say waste their time, but even if I did have 3 ATSs that I wanted to work through and like present that to them, until they were physically in it, it didn't make sense. So I think going back to our earlier conversation of how I know our team and how I know how our team operates, I was able to use my knowledge of how it would work within the decision-making process. But at the end of the day, yes, I made the final decision, got approval from my CEO and the VP.
Got it. And what was that approval process like? I know you mentioned, and this happens to a lot of companies, especially at that size, is going to the year, it's not a budget, it's not a line item in the budget, and then all of a sudden there's a need. How do you get that approval?
Yeah. So honestly, usually my CEO is awesome because he will poke holes in everything that I bring in. And I mean that in like the nicest way possible. He sees it from a different perspective. And so he asks questions that I don't think of, right? So if I see it's like, oh, it's pretty and I can use it and it's super easy for me and it's automated. And then he'll ask the questions that I didn't think of. For this particular case, it was literally a Christmas present for me or a holiday present for me because we did sign up on December. And it was, so we used Spark Hire. I know that you're obviously aware of that. And it really had everything that we needed to be successful. And it was such an easy transition from Monday that for this particular use case, I was ready. I was ready for him to ask me a million questions. And it had everything we needed, that it was the easiest yes he's ever given me. And that's why I say it was my holiday present, because he immediately was like, okay, that makes sense. And the cost was really right. And it was going to save from an efficiency standpoint because of that.
That's great. What are some of those, like for other people that are, in a similar position, maybe thinking about standing up their first ATS, they've got to go get executive buy-in. What are some of those questions to expect? Like what was your CEO asking you, or what, broadly would somebody expect in that type of conversation?
Yeah, I think probably that, and he probably did ask this, like, why is this better than what we're currently doing? So that's the first thing. And so obviously, as we talked about, like the manualness of Monday was just really a lot for me to do again and again. And if we started the new year with it again, like the amount of data that lived in Monday that sometimes got lost. So one thing that's nice is when you upload a resume or you put in somebody's information into Spark Hire, it'll find you, right? But if I'm manually uploading your resume, Monday isn't an ATS. So it doesn't do that. So that was one thing. That's probably the biggest use case is, why is this better than what you're currently using? Again, like why should I spend X amount of dollars for this over what you're currently using? Obviously, most companies use LinkedIn. This particular product has a LinkedIn integration, which is super helpful. And so we shrunk our LinkedIn package, which for those, everybody knows LinkedIn is an incredibly expensive investment. And so it saved us money on that end. I actually think that at the end of the day, we're spending less money because we were able to save on the LinkedIn integration, because as soon as we post a position through Spark Hire, it's already posted on LinkedIn. So just as a little bit of a sales nugget there. So that's the other thing is like, aren't you using LinkedIn? You said we need LinkedIn. We have to have LinkedIn. So why do we need that? So that's the other question. And then certainly going to ask about the team members. So are the team members actually going to use this? Is it going to be worthwhile for us to invest in something? You're signing on for a 12-month contract with this company and we don't know if it's going to work. What are those reasons, or why do you think the team will do a better job with it?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I think, it's one thing to compare, here's what we're doing today from a cost perspective versus here's what we'll be doing tomorrow from a cost perspective. And there's ways to validate the investment in that way, or even say, hey, we're going to be saving money because of X, Y, and Z by going with this other solution versus the status quo. But what about like, as far as like actual hiring results, right? Like at the end of the day, like the company needs to hire great people. It needs to do it faster. It needs to do it on time. So we've got those people on the team so they can start performing and contributing to the company's top line. So like, how do you compare that against the status quo? Like, how do you validate to somebody on the executive committee, whether it's a CEO or a group of people or the CFO, that like, at the end of the day, this solution is going to help us hire better, right? Hire better, hire faster, do something to improve our hiring results.
Yeah, I think the biggest case point is that we've got the analytics behind it to be able to prove that it does. And so with this, again, like taking, the integration with LinkedIn is great. So whether it is me sourcing through LinkedIn, which is why we still have a LinkedIn recruiter seat, or if it is the postings that are automatically going out to LinkedIn and the data coming in. Also, everything comes in one spot. So if we were posting on LinkedIn, sometimes we've used Indeed, we've used other resources. That means that I am in all these different platforms to be able to get the data and gathering that. And just from a time-saving perspective alone, but there's also, if you applied to our role on LinkedIn and Indeed, and now I've pulled you into Monday, you have two profiles, if you apply multiple places through our ATS, it finds you and it links you together. So just from that, the time saving alone for me being the only recruiter doing the outbound is huge. And so I think that's something that certainly, like, to highlight, having the ATS, we are at the right size. We, have filled at any time, we have 6 to 8 openings, and that alone, feeding through, countless candidates across all of those different roles, there is just a seamlessness that exists with it.
Yeah. And it's interesting. You mentioned you guys have 6 to 8 open roles at any given time. Like, you're 30 people right now, but generally, I feel like there might be a lot of companies that at 30 people, they're like, oh, we don't need an ATS. We'll keep doing the status quo. We're not big enough yet. But like, what is that tipping point? Is it a certain number of like growth roles targeted? Because I always tell companies, like, look, you're also going to be backfilling and you have to factor that in to your hiring plans as well. So like, what would you say is the tipping point of volume that, creates that need?
Yeah, I think, one thing that we started doing really well last year was resource planning. And so with those 6 to 8 roles, it doesn't mean we have 6 to 8 openings that we need to fill immediately. They're really evergreen posts. So we are building up talent pools and building relationships with future candidates. And so I would say that is the case. Like, at the start of the year, when we were thinking of, okay, we're going to need somebody on our social team, we're going to need somebody on our search team, we're going to need somebody on our media strategy team. So we have so many different openings across the categories that we need, because we don't know that, yes, we're going to have a need today. Yep. We want to make sure that we can have the talent pool built up. And so I think that really was a really great catalyst for us to be able to know what was happening. Again, diving into Monday, there's a lot, it's gray. Like, you have to play around with it. You have to create a lot of the tags. Going into an ATS, you just go to the role, you see everything that you need to see in one-stop shop. So I think that piece really, for a team that is small, you should always have evergreen posts, because to your point, there's going to be turnover, expected or unexpected. If you're an agency and you're talking to clients, you have no idea what a new client might bring to the table. We have certainly experienced where a client's budget when they sign with us is this, and then 3 weeks later, it skyrockets. And so when a client's budget is higher, you certainly have a need for spending a little bit more money, because in making sure that you've got the right candidate flow, or team member flow, excuse me. So those are some of the things that I think are really important. And having an ATS with a talent pool is golden, because then it's not just like, oh, I'm maintaining a relationship, an email relationship with so-and-so. And if Eric says, hey, remember that candidate we interviewed 6 weeks ago? Like, and then I'm trying to like rack my brain versus just going into the ATS and finding the information. So even if you're not really underwater with recruiting and you're like in a good place and you feel really confident, you have no idea what's going to happen on Monday morning and how many potential roles you might need to fill. So the ATS from a talent pool perspective is awesome. There's tagging options, so you know that you're going to go back to. One success story we had a team member. She did her Spark Hire interview on Valentine's Day, and we all loved her. We ended up hiring somebody with a little bit more experience. And then 3 weeks later, we realized we needed another person. She was still available, and she started with us at the end of April. So there is a huge win for that talent pool element, even if you're not like, oh my God, I have so many roles I need to recruit for. That talent pool really does help to kind of give you a starting off point when a role populates.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, for any company that's in, let's call it the professional services category, where they're like a people powered business, and some of their needs for people internally are dependent on how much a client may scale with their services. And so you don't necessarily want to be overstaffed, right? Because you don't know when a client may scale their services, and they may not. but you need to be building those relationships with candidates in the talent pipeline. So if they do, you're not starting from ground zero.
Yeah, that's huge, because as soon as we do have to start from ground zero, like the level of anxiety, right? That I'm like, oh my God, they need somebody and I don't have anywhere to start. Like that's really difficult.
Yep.
And so we did actually create a brand new role that we're currently recruiting for, and we were ahead of the game. We're like, by the end of the summer, we're looking to bring on a creative resource. And so we started out by posting it and just seeing what was out there and getting it. So it was we were able to slowly get to where we needed to be. And again, that goes back to the fact that we do a really good job with resource planning to know like that's going to be a tipping point, whether it be August or October or whatever the case may be. But it really does, especially with a new role, it's going to be a longer cycle than if we are hiring the same type of candidates, because we know what we're looking for. We know what the candidate pool looks like versus a brand new scope. It's starting from scratch. So
yep.
Definitely resource planning and having a solid talent pool is super, super important to be successful.
Yeah. And I think it also, ties back to the point we were talking about getting buy-in from a business outcome standpoint. The reality is if you have these evergreen roles and you're building pipeline, your speed to revenue is much quicker when that need does come about because you're so much ahead of the game. But if you're not doing that proactive sourcing and you're not building that pipeline and those relationships, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, client wants to triple their budget, but guess what? We don't have the people. It's like guaranteed missed revenue for the company. And so, that's how I think a lot of people, especially in the professional services space, can tie the things they're doing with the recruiting systems back to revenue and top line business outcomes that really speak to like the CEO, the CFO, and whoever else is involved at that level.
And then from a people perspective, we're also helping our existing team so that they're not overwhelmed. So like, that's what I look at, right? Like you look at revenue because you're the CEO. I look at the team and make sure that they feel like they're getting the support. So like, that's again, that yin and yang, which I think is super helpful to make sure that we do have the resources ready to go as needed.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think especially, and that's where I think the advantage of you, helping on both the talent acquisition side, but then on the rest of the employee experience side is like, you'll get a sense of burnout or if workload is too high. And then it's like, okay, we've got to, maybe we don't have a need now, but like we got to pick up the proactive sourcing because like seems like we're almost operating at the red line of capacity. And so we're close to having a need. And so it's like, okay, we can press the gas a bit here on the sourcing side. So I think that's really an interesting point that you bring up there. So you make an ATS decision, you're going to press ahead. How do you think about implementation? Like you're a one person team, and for most companies that are standing up their first ATS, that's going to be the case. They've got one or two people in HR/talent acquisition and kind of doing everything under the sun. And it's like, okay, now let's stand up an ATS, which can seem a bit daunting at first. So how do you approach that to make sure A, implementation goes well, but also B, you're not like overwhelmed by everything that's in front of you, which could, I think, in some cases cause companies to like not take the step forward to implement an ATS because they don't want to, take on all the work that seems like it's ahead of them.
Yeah. And I will tell you just a little anecdote. So right after I started at ADM, we were struggling with our payroll company. They were just like making a ton of errors. So I was like, that's it. I'm going to find a new payroll solution. So I did. And the implementation of a new payroll system is the most daunting thing I've ever done in my whole entire life. It was so much work, so much more work than I expected, that I still have PTSD, that even when thinking like, should we switch payroll providers? Nope, not there yet. Can't do it. So I definitely had that, fear, right? I think the timing for us was great because it was the start of the year. So we were really like starting into it. The best thing about the implementation is that the process that was set out for us through Spark Hire was so seamless that it literally was like, we're going to do it in chunks. And so that really, really helps. But even with a payroll provider, they try to do it in chunks to really get you acclimated to what it is. And that really helps The other thing is, while we had a ton of data in Monday.com, at no point did I want to bring that over. I thought that was just going to muddy the waters. So I made the decision we were starting from scratch. We were starting with 0 candidates within the ATS. Now, definitely if you've got a system and you want to upload those people, you certainly can. There were a couple of candidates that I, of course, manually uploaded into the system because they were still actively involved, but that really helped. And then if there is somebody that I'm like, I think I met this person before, or their name sounds familiar, I can still go to Monday and see if they're in there, and occasionally they are. But that really was very helpful. And then I understood it very well before we started using it for real. So before the hiring team started diving into the platform and having questions that I wouldn't be able to answer. So I started going through. There was a time where I was starting to interview through the ATS, but I still was having the team use the old model until we were really ready, so that it didn't overwhelm and they didn't get mixed responses from me, like, oh, you're supposed to do this. Oh, no, I got it wrong. So that it really was very thorough. I think it was a 4 to 6 week process, but it did really make it very smooth for us to transition. So you definitely have to set a good chunk of time to spend time with your implementation specialist and really diving into the platform, because just like anything, it is, a totally new world. But having it start from scratch was really helpful. My recommendation on that is start from scratch to begin with, and then if you realize you want all those candidates in the platform, you can do that in an upload type of situation. But I feel like if we started that way, it would have just been so messy to not have a fresh start.
Got it. Yeah, and I think that's an important point, especially for companies that are looking to stand up their first ATS. It's like you're coming from a system that was, hacked together, DIY, like, it exists over here. That's what you're used to using. That's fine. Like, keep that over there. Don't let it be a barrier to trying to figure out, like, okay, how are we going to map all this unstructured data now to a new system? Instead, like, focus on building the foundation and the processes and the workflows and everything in the new system on a clean slate versus trying to like re-implement old processes that were built for, a system that was, cobbled together, start fresh. You also mentioned the hiring managers, and I think it was smart that you waited to you didn't throw them in there day one. It's like you got your feet under you a little bit before you brought them over. So my question, two-part question would be, A, how did you know when they were ready? And B, how did you get them ready / excited for that transition, given they were so used to using the one project management system that they use for their regular, day-to-day jobs?
Yeah. So I probably didn't know if they were ready, truthfully. It was a little bit of throwing them to the fire, because I'm sure they would have been confident just to continue going in the method they were doing. So to answer your first question, it was probably more like a push than hey, you guys want to try this? Secondly, I introduced it ahead of time. So it wasn't just putting a call on the schedule for them to, hey, you're going to go do this training and this is what we're going to do. So I definitely provided them a lot of insight, the reason why we were using it, why it was going to be easier for them, how we were going to get the data. It was going to be very seamless. We were going to do a full implementation training that was going to be recorded so they can revisit it and things of that nature. So definitely setting them up for the why is really important to make sure that it does make sense. I will say unsolicited compliments on the platform have come even to this day. We were just in Colorado for our team offsite, and I was sitting at dinner next to one of our associate directors. He's like, hey, I just want to let you know I love the ATS. It's so great. It's so easy. So completely unsolicited advice or not advice, unsolicited compliments still are coming from the team, because of course they also aren't in it all the time. It just depends on when they have an opening. So we've got 6 associate directors and 2 directors. And sometimes, they're in it for a couple of weeks, we fill a role, and then they're not in it for again. So definitely, it's something they need to be able to easily jump back into if they haven't touched it in a month, 6 weeks, 2 months, and that it would be super easy for them.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. All right, my last question is, you start with an ATS. How do you define, how do we know this was a good decision? What success metrics are we monitoring? How do we know what we've done is working 3, 6, 12 months later?
Yeah. So we, obviously we're using the data. Again, we were pretty fortunate that we did start it in Q1. So we were, most of the information about our hiring is pretty even. So a little shout out to our hiring flow. So in Q1, I think our speed to hire or time to hire was just under 60 days, which was about similar to what I would say I was figuring out on my own manually. And then in Q2, it was 38 days, which if you ask any recruiter, like most people will say 60 days is pretty much average from the time you identify that you need to fill a role till the person starts. And so 38 days, we hired 7 people in Q2, which again, 7 people might sound like, nothing if you're a 1,000-person organization, but remembering that we're a 30-person organization, that's a pretty large chunk of new hires. And so that really was the proof in the pudding, if you will, to use a silly line, that it works, because it really was built into the efficiency. Again, going back to things we've talked about, the talent pool. Again, we were able to hire somebody because she was in the talent pool, because we interviewed her earlier on in the year, and ease for us to just dive right in to the platform and to be able to see the candidates in there. So those are the things that are the most important, is time to hire. The other thing to highlight is it documents how much time our hiring managers are spending in interviews. So not just me, but how much time the hiring manager is spending in interviews. So it's very much a double-edged sword. We need to hire, but we also have a job to do, and hiring isn't our job, right? So like for the hiring managers, really making sure that the amount of time that they're in interviews is efficient to get to the right person. And so we've also seen a decrease in that, which means that we're able to identify quality over quantity, which of course, helps in the long run because it's saving time and then obviously saving money.
Yeah, love it. It sounds like you guys have really, narrowed down to focus on a few core metrics that really emphasize both speed, because we know the importance of that to getting to the right person, but also quality, because you want to not only hire that person fast, but you want them to be a good person that's now going to stick in the organization for a long time to come. So that's awesome. Melanie, this has been great. Super informative. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining me. There's just so many insights on this, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Josh. It was a pleasure connecting with you and chatting through. It's always fun to kind of speak geek, if you will, because I talk about digital marketing all day long. So it's nice to talk a little bit more on the recruiting end.
Awesome. Thank you.